Hi, thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Jessie Harris, and today we'll be discussing the shift in data management's role from paper to EDC. To give some brief information about myself, I've been working in data management for close to 12 years and have managed this data management shift from paper to EDC multiple times. One housekeeping note, you can submit your questions in the lower right-hand corner anytime, and I will answer them at the end of the presentation. Today's objectives are to identify the areas in data management which require a shift in roles and perspective when moving from a paper to an EDC system, and to identify and implement solutions to making that shift as seamless as possible. Just to clarify, we won't be discussing and/or reviewing EDC systems. There are a lot out there, and they all have their pros and cons and bells and whistles. The purpose of this webinar is to really discuss the general data management processes in regards to the paper to EDC transition. Obviously, the EDC system you're using has an impact on particular data management procedures. However, the general processes remain the same. In the early days of EDC, there was a misconception that EDC would essentially replace much of data management. Many of the data management tasks you see in a paper study are either no longer required or are set up to be done automatically. These include CRF tracking, entry and filing, query processing, and data audit. The question was, since data managers would no longer be responsible for the bulk of on-study work, what else was left for them to do? In actuality, the impact of EDC on data management is not as enormous as originally thought. Although traditional paper study management is impacted by EDC, that impact is really not significant. In the end, the idea behind data management is the same with EDC as it is with paper, and that's data quality. How data quality is achieved and maintained with EDC versus paper only requires a slight shift in the data manager's processes and views. So we'll be looking at the following areas during this webinar: resource allocation, data quality, roles and responsibilities, and communication. Since these items are already established with paper data management, it's just a matter of evaluating and adjusting them when data management moves from paper to EDC. The analogy I came up with is to picture data management as a house. When you move to EDC, you aren't moving houses, building or tearing down the house. You're really just repainting some rooms and at most knocking down a few walls. If your paper data management processes are established and strong, you might as well use what you can for EDC. You just need to evaluate the particular areas I mentioned and make the necessary adjustments. This is also an opportunity to make improvements and add efficiencies to your established processes. Data management's move over to EDC has the potential to be relatively painless and the potential to make your processes and groups stronger. So with the shift from paper to EDC, resource allocation must be reassessed. Here's a very general graphical representation of the level of data management activity over the course of a paper study. In paper studies, the data management work has traditionally spiked at the start and end of the study. There's a flurry of activity to get the study set up, and then another flurry of activity to get the database locked. Additionally, because much of the data manager's work is dependent on the CRFs arriving in-house, it is usually difficult to anticipate the workload of data managers during the study. During these times, one normally sees spikes of activity with longer intervals of low activity in the workloads of the data managers. In EDC studies, we see a change in how the data manager's workload is dispersed. At the beginning of the study, there is usually a bit of a higher spike of activity as compared with a paper study. This is usually due to an increased amount of programming needed for the edit check messages and instructions, the programming of the eCRF entry screens, as well as the training of sites and monitors on the EDC system. The additional resources and requirements to set up an EDC study need to be accounted for in study timelines as well as individual timelines and workloads. During the study, the data manager's workload becomes more evenly dispersed. Data managers will essentially be checking the data and query status on a set schedule, and I'll be touching on this in more detail in just a bit. Data managers no longer need to oversee the receipt and processing of CRFs. There may be small spikes of activity with mid-study ECRF changes, new cohorts, replacement training, etc., but overall, the data manager's activity remains fairly stable. Towards the end of the study, or study lock, there will be a slight increase in data manager's activity, but it won't be nearly as much as you would see in a paper study. The data manager will be spending their time confirming all queries are closed and locking down data and system access. Much of this can also be done during the study for efficiency. The flurry of activity associated with QC and audits you see during the paper database locks is removed with EDC database locks. So here you can see a very general representation of data management activity for an EDC study and a paper study, and really where those activity levels differ the most. Again, this is a very general representation of data management activity, and of course, not all studies are going to follow these particular patterns. So what all of this means is that as a data management department moves more and more from paper to EDC studies, it's necessary that the department's resources be assessed and reallocated as necessary. Resources may be shifted to the setup of an EDC study to enable a shorter startup time, and as experience with query messages and training materials increases, those processes should become more streamlined and more time is therefore saved. Additionally, due to great predictability of work with EDC studies, it's possible that a data manager is able to handle more studies concurrently than they can with paper studies. Furthermore, since the burden of receiving and processing CRFs is removed, the data management resources needed for conducting the trial is reduced, providing further opportunities for personal growth in other areas. Moving on, I want to further discuss the data manager's role in ensuring data quality, since this is the main objective of the data manager. With EDC, the underlying query process is essentially the same. However, the timeline is really greatly reduced. What you see is that the data manager shifts their role from active generator and contributor of queries to a more removed role of overseer of queries. In traditional paper studies, the programmed edit checks are typically run on a batch schedule. Upon the edit checks being run, the data manager transfers any queries to the data correction forms and distributes those DCFs to the site for resolution. Upon return of the DCFs, the data manager updates the data as needed. The process allows the data manager to review for accuracy all queries being generated, as well as the accuracy of the query responses. If the edit check isn't functioning properly or the query response isn't logical, the data manager then takes corrective action. With EDC, many queries are both generated and resolved within minutes without the data manager's involvement at all. The EDC edit checks are programmed to run on the data upon data entry, resulting in an on-screen query being generated instantly. Many times, the query is resolved immediately by the site. EDC has a drastically reduced turnaround time of queries. Because the data manager is no longer actively involved in the data entry or query processing, it is easy for a detachment with the data and even the study to occur. So a few items, some of which may be done already in paper studies, but which move to the forefront in EDC studies, should be implemented to counter this detachment. The first is the review of the entry and monitoring status of the data. Data managers should work with the project managers to always be aware of the enrollment status and visit schedule of the subjects. These items should then be used to review the entry and monitoring status of the data to ensure that they are done within the agreed upon and or reasonable time frame. Many EDC systems offer tools to help track these items, and the data manager is responsible for following up on these items. After all, the data quality really cannot be checked until the data is present. The second item is regular review of data listings. This may be done across all sites or within a site or other subset of data. The data manager should routinely review and apply additional logic checks to the data. The most obvious are simple A to Z checks for which the data manager looks for gaps and or anomalies in the data. While many of these items may be caught with the programmed edit checks, many edit checks typically don't take into account trends in the data, and therefore data outliers may be missed. Additionally, critical data that will be used for analysis should be reviewed on a regular basis to confirm completion and logic of that data. The third process to implement is a review of the query trends. Data managers should ask what ECRFs are being queried the most, what fields are being queried the most, and what sites have the most queries. What is the average response time for queries, and what query type is most generated? For example, missing data, numeric range checks, date checks, spelling, etc. Many EDC systems have metrics in place to capture this type of query summary data. Results of these questions should be acted upon by the data manager by making necessary improvements to the ECRF setup, EDC instructions, ECRF completion guidelines, site training, and or edit check definitions and programming. All of these improvements will also help lead to better data quality for the current study, as well as provide lessons learned to apply to future EDC studies. And another process for the data manager to implement is a review of the queries for which the site responded with the equivalent of data okay as is. These are queries for which data was not changed to meet the quality criteria. Since data okay as is usually the easiest and the quickest response to make to a query, it also tends to be the most erroneous response as well. It is important that the flag data be reviewed by the data manager to ensure the response is acceptable. A query does not need to be posted, and or an edit check definition or programming does not need to be modified. Along with the shift from EDC to paper comes the shift of roles and responsibilities of the data managers. It's important that the EDC job responsibilities of the data manager be clearly defined and understood before the start of the study. As mentioned earlier, since entry and query resolution is done with minimal participation of the data manager, there needs to be clarification with what the data manager is actually involved with. Additionally, since EDC may still be new to some study team members, it's important that not only data managers, but the entire study team is clear on their roles and responsibilities. During the study, if a question arises regarding a responsibility, data managers should be trained to take on that responsibility, at least until the appropriate team member is identified to assume the task. This helps establish a sense of reliability with the data manager. This also helps to avoid finger pointing among the team members, which then results in study delays. Since EDC studies are usually fairly time sensitive, it's crucial to avoid these unnecessary holdups. Some questions to ask during a study startup are, who will be responsible for training the sites on the EDC system and the study's ECRF? For example, will the data manager train the monitor or project manager who will then train the sites, or will the data manager train everyone? Another question, who will be responsible for IT questions like forgotten passwords? And another question, who will be responsible for protocol questions? For example, what should happen if the subject missed a visit? Also, more questions could be, who will be responsible for site questions on posted queries? Who will be responsible for locking data entry after all queries are resolved and data is confirmed clean? And who will be responsible for following up with a site on data entry delays and outstanding queries? It is important to establish answers to these questions at the start of the study and confirm each study team individual is aware of his or her responsibilities. One important idea here is to streamline the responsibilities as much as possible and have as few people as possible responsible for each of these areas. This now leads us to the next and final section, communication. This last item for data managers to concentrate on for EDC studies is by far the most important and is the item heard time and time again. Data management departments have a history of being one of the hidden steps in clinical drug development. They tend to be the anonymous people behind such popular items as queries and database locks. With the implementation of EDC, the style of interaction data managers have with the sites and monitors must change. Data managers must take on a more active role in communicating with the study team. Communication, which starts with the training of sites and monitors on the EDC system and study ECRF, should continue throughout the study with support and management. All of the items mentioned in the previous sections should be communicated on a regular basis to the rest of the study team. Because there are many people across sites involved with the same task of data entry and query resolution, the idea is to make sure that training and processes stay consistent across sites and team members. This means communicating any issues or new processes that arise as quickly and effectively as possible. It's essential a solid communication plan is in place at the beginning of the study. As mentioned with roles and responsibilities, it's also vital that the communication plan is streamlined and there are not 20 different people to contact for 20 different issues. The larger the EDC study, the more essential it is that points of contacts are established. Of course, it does not mean that communication should always follow a single direction. The communication plan must be flexible enough to handle time-sensitive issues that arise. The communication plan or a separate plan must also incorporate the actions the data manager will follow in regards to mid-study ECRF or edit check changes, retraining or training of replacements, communication of EDC versus study issues, etc. One item to do and or encourage, whether it's a paper or an EDC study, is to bring the study team together once they are identified. At minimum, the data managers, project managers, and monitors should attend this meeting. This is a good time to review the roles and responsibilities so everybody is aware not only of their own responsibilities, but the other team members' responsibilities as well. Additionally, this is an opportunity for everyone to voice questions and or concerns about the project. This type of meeting will go a long way in helping establish a solid, open communication working rapport. This is essential for a successful study and will also help open the communication of the data management department with other team members. So in summary, EDC data management involves many of the same core procedures and responsibilities. When shifting data management from paper to EDC, it is important to pay particular attention to the areas we just went over. Resource evaluation and allocation. You must recognize the differences in the data management activity level of an EDC study versus a paper study. Data managers must identify the areas and personnel in the data management department that may be shifted to support the higher levels of activity for an EDC study setup, and to evaluate the EDC study workload of data managers. Can data managers handle more studies with EDC? For data quality, they must recognize the underlying processes are the same, but the timing is compressed. The data manager should remain engaged in the query process by reviewing the data entry and monitoring status of the data, reviewing data listings, query trends, and the OK as is query responses. For study roles and responsibilities should be clearly defined for each study team member. The data manager should take the lead when any EDC process questions arise, and the data manager should list process questions out in order to establish answers before the study starts. Data managers should take on a more active role with communication to the project manager, monitors, and sites. They should keep training and processes consistent across study personnel. They should establish a streamlined and flexible communication plan. And if not already planned, propose and arrange an initial study team meeting with the data managers, project managers, and monitors. So, in summary, data managers must realize that EDC data management is not hands-off after the study is set up. They remain an active part of the study team. It's also important to remember that the shift of data management from paper to EDC is not extreme, and the underlying objective of data managers remain the same: to contribute to the quality and timely delivery of the data. So now we'll move on to questions. I see a few questions were posted. Let's see, one listener posted, is it possible to implement EDC but keep the ability of handling paper studies? The answer to that is an absolute yes. Let's see. First of all, although EDC studies are taking off, we're seeing a significant decrease in the number of paper studies. And I believe paper studies will really linger around for a long time. The obvious advantages in being able to handle both paper and EDC studies are business and flexibility. My recommendation is not to split paper and EDC out into two separate subgroups of data management. Data managers should really be trained on both paper and EDC studies. So this will not only increase their depth of knowledge, but it will also allow efficiencies to be gained by the department. There are many studies out there that are hybrid as well, a combination of both paper and EDC. And I think it's necessary that these types of studies be handled by the same data management lead to ensure seamlessness. Another question posted was, in your experience, how have data managers responded to the switch to EDC? This is a good question. I've seen a range of responses, and of course, not everyone is going to feel the same way about it. I feel the majority have been positive, but there have definitely been some people who have resisted the change. And I have to say it's more to do with the technological shift than the specific shift from paper to EDC. It's understandable because once you learn a system really well, it's hard to make a change to a new system. And you have to accept that there will be a learning curve for some people, and they'd rather not bother at all. I've always tried to point out that the switch isn't just a benefit for the company, but also for the employee. They will probably be gaining more efficiencies in their work with the switch, but they'll also increase their knowledge base by learning a new system, and it will essentially make them more valuable in the eyes of future employers. Another question that was posted is, what have the average times you've seen it take to implement a new EDC system? So obviously one item this depends on is the system complexity. There are a lot of EDC vendors out there, and their systems really range from the simple to the complex. If you're using a system with just basic functionalities and an intuitive design, the learning curve will clearly be shorter than it would be with a more complex system. Additionally, the timing also depends on what you will be doing with the system. If the EDC vendor will be doing the database setup and/or edit check programming, and you don't need to learn these, then it will obviously cut out a great deal of the training need. I guess just a very general estimate, I think training can probably be done within 1 to 3 months, depending on the factors I just mentioned. I would just make sure that you build in some buffer timelines on the first few studies you manage on the new system. So I see some additional questions were posted. I apologize that we are out of time. I will make sure to follow up with those individuals who posted those questions. So that's the end of this webinar. Thank you so very much for attending. I hope you enjoyed it and that you gained some useful information out of it. Please feel free to email me with any follow-up questions you may have. Thanks again.